this statement from Macquarie University. Macquarie University recognises the custodianship of the land on which our campus is situated, the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation, and pays respect to their Aboriginal elders, past, present and future. And while we're paying respect, I'd like to pay, as president of this society, our respect to elders past and present of this society who established in their wisdom this society, and also who established the ancient history department of Macquarie University, and which was the envy of the world. And one of those we have two of them here. We have Tom Hillard and Elena, and we have Chris, who's going to speak to us now. And Edwin, is Edwin here? Oh, there you are, Edwin. Good to see you, mate. Good to see you. So Chris Forbes is our first speaker, and really Chris needs no introduction because whatever Chris says is great. It's great, and it's informative, and also lively. So Chris is speaking on family and followers, the language of kinship in early Christianity. So I'll hand it over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Don. It's good to know that I need no introduction. People who say these things, but they never actually live by them, do they? However, let me begin with what's printed in the booklet because I'm actually quite pleased with it. Kinship is something which ought to be obvious and uncontroversial. You can choose your friends, we are told, but you can't choose your family. Not everyone is committed to family values, but we all think we know what they are. The family is the most basic unit of society. Everybody says so. Aristotle certainly said so. But do we mean the nuclear family, the extended family, or some other form of family? Who is included? It is not often commented on that the foundational story of Christianity implicitly undermines any simple formulation of the family. The mother, Mary, remains central, but Joseph is not the father, and Jesus cannot be his son. And in his public career, Jesus radically re-evaluated conventional family language. When told that his mother and brothers wanted to speak to him, Jesus replied that whoever hears and does the will of God, my Father in heaven, is my mother and sister and brother. In other words, more than they are. In some circumstances, he required his followers to even break with their families. And even more dramatically, in Matthew 10:35 and Luke 12:51, he warned that his message would divide families in fundamental ways. It has become conventional to describe the Jesus movement as being, in sociological terms, a fictive family. In more conventional language, it was to be like a family, a metaphorical family. This is not only true in the Gospels. In Acts and in the letters, brother is the most common term for a fellow believer. Further, becoming a Christian can be described as adoption, and the benefits of belief are described as an inheritance. God was to be understood as Father, though others could be in a secondary sense. And in some cases, Jesus was an elder brother. Clearly, these are family metaphors, but how are they to be understood? How did first century Christians understand family? Did Jewish believers hear different nuances to those detected by Greco-Roman believers? Further, the literal family of Jesus, I use literal in a non-literal sense here, with scare quotes around it deliberately. Mary, James, Jude, and others, the so-called desposinoi, remained central in the development of the Jesus movement for more than a century after his death. And those of you who are part of the Curtain Raiser event would have heard stories about some of the stories being historical, some of them being possibly historical, and others of them being almost certainly legendary. But what do we mean by literal with scare quotes around it? And what family metaphors were most important in the formation of that movement? I'm going to be focusing primarily on the earliest documents we have of the early Christian movement, that is to say, the letters of St. Paul, but I want to make it clear that the language is far more widespread than in those. But even in our own world, kinship is complicated. We all take it for granted that we know who it is we're related to. But we also know that definitions vary in complicated ways from culture to culture, and within one culture over time. Biological kinship need not be the same as cultural understandings of kinship. Take, for example, the complex rules about marriage to near relatives. Can first cousins marry? Is the issue a culturally sanctioned biogenetic piece of common sense? Maybe. But if that's true for first cousins, what do we do with the definition of second cousins twice removed, or great uncles? Probably only a family history expert could tell you. Who here knows the definition of the difference between the agnate line and the cognate line in a family? Not many, I suspect. And that's only in Anglo culture. Northern Aboriginal culture has skin groups and complex rules about who is allowed to marry whom and not permitted to. And have you noticed that the use of the terms auntie and uncle have become standard in Aboriginal cultures for almost any respected elder, regardless of their biological kinship? And of course, in New Zealand, any male contemporary at all can be addressed as bro. Most striking case, however, came from anthropological study in New Guinea, where New Guinea natives told the anthropologist in question that cassowaries were not birds. Cassowaries in their language and in their culture were not categorized as birds for a number of intriguing reasons. Number one, they didn't have feathers. They had filaments of hair instead. Number two, they didn't have a brain. That is to say, they had a bony lump on the top of their head that obviously didn't leave much room for a brain. But number three, and probably most importantly, the anthropologist said, cassowaries weren't birds because they were our cousins. What did that mean? It appears, though this is simplifying a complex situation, that it meant that some humans live in the garden subdivisions, the cleared land. Some other animals live in the jungle, but cassowaries live on the boundary, halfway between. They're not quite human, they're not quite animals, they're kind of cousins. And when these particular New Guinea people saw cassowaries, they would say, oh, look, there are the cousins. Kinship is a complex business. Cassowaries are cousins, but the question whether you could marry one simply didn't arise. At a simple level, naming conventions are clearly related to kinship. But our own culture is currently in transition on this topic. In my parents' generation, it was taken for granted that a wife would normally take her husband's family name. In the late 70s and early 80s, it could not be taken for granted. but overwhelmingly children still took their father's family name. More recently, it has become common to use hyphenated double family names, but I suggest to you that this can only be a temporary solution. It only works at one generation. After that, it just gets awfully complicated. And the reality of multicultural Australia makes the situation even more complex. Iranian Australian families don't take the patrilineal name and never have. Under what name do their children enroll in school? Under what name do they get passports? It's not obvious. And it's not only not obvious to them, it's not obvious to the government institutions as well. In English, it is, of course, an acceptable cliché that blood is thicker than water. And most people understand immediately what the saying means. Blood has to do with blood relationships. And they are more important, thicker than others, obviously. But in biological fact, blood relatives regularly have different, even completely different and incompatible blood types. Blood is a metaphor for kinship, not a literal description. And intriguingly, it is a common one across cultures. The Greeks talked about being people of one blood. The Romans did as well. Consanguinity means, in Latin, coming from the one blood. No, kinship and its related social conventions are never simple, and when we try to understand those of a complex fusion of Roman, Greek and Jewish cultures 2,000 years ago, we must expect complication. Family language is used metaphorically in some contexts in Judaism. In the Hebrew Bible, the most common term for fellow Israelites is your own flesh and blood. The term is used in Genesis 15, in Judges, in Samuel, in Kings and Chronicles, in Nehemiah, and in Isaiah. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, uses the terms flesh and blood and the terms flesh and bone. Israelites can be described to other Israelites as your brother. See Deuteronomy 3:18 or Deuteronomy 15:1-3, where the terminology is used twice. But it's not terribly common
not a
in
single
the
cable.
or in the Greek translation.
I've got one of these.
Other terms dominate.
I've got one of those.
In Second Temple Judaism, in other words, Judaism broadly contemporary with Christianity and the rise of its movement, is it true that brotherhood language was used of what we might perhaps call covenant brothers? Yes, it is, occasionally.
This is not
Josephus tells us, Jewish War 2:122, that the Essene Jews addressed each other as brothers. And the term was used at Qumran, and for that matter, by soldiers of Bar Kokhba in the Second Jewish Revolt. But it's not only there, it's also in 1 Maccabees 2:40-41, where the Jewish rebels against Greek dominance said, if we all do as our kindred, that's the NRSV, literally it's our brothers, if we all do as our brothers have done and refuse to fight with the Gentiles for our lives and for our laws, they will quickly destroy us from the earth. So they made this decision that day. Let us fight against anyone who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Let us not all die as our brothers died in their hiding places. So in Second Temple Judaism, the term brother was occasionally used as a metaphor to mean any Israelite. In 1 Maccabees 12:10 and 17, the Maccabean rebels tried to set up an alliance with the people of Sparta, which they described as renewing our brotherhood and friendship. Now there's a different field. You can now describe people who have no ethnic relationship with you at all,
I don't think so.
but with whom you're setting up a political relationship as your brothers. There are plenty of New Testament passages where the term brother
Are we on the
also
camera?
means fellow Israelite.
We're just
And I
watching.
take it that that's Second Temple Jewish literature as well.
Hi, everyone.
So there's good evidence that you could use the term brother metaphorically. Let's go back to the term
You haven't got
blood.
it muted, though.
Blood is also a metaphor for kinship in the Greek world, as I mentioned. Herodotus, Book 8, section 144, talks about
Mute
the
ourselves.
kinship of all Greeks in blood and speech,
I presume
and the common temples of the gods and sacrifices in our customs. But blood and speech, ethnicity, we would probably say, plus language, come first.
Group muted it.
they probably would.
In Aristotle, the idea becomes biological orthodoxy. Humans reproduce when blood from the female is blended with sperm from the male. So blood is involved in the process of reproduction. And in Rome, Galen argued the same. Human reproduction occurred slightly differently because both men and women contributed seed, which was formed from blood, hence the term consanguinity, hence the idea of blood lines. So in both Greek and Roman culture, blood was a metaphor for kinship. But both Greeks and Romans also regularly used the concept of shared ancestry, describing it as brotherhood in political and diplomatic contexts. The earliest example I'm aware of is Polybius' account of the treaty between the Carthaginian general Hannibal and Philip V of Macedon, which talks about them being of one blood, which is clearly not ethnic language here, let alone biological language. It is clearly political, diplomatic language. More of that as we go on. From the general picture, we now focus down onto family language and the fact that family language is more dominant as a metaphor in early Christian literature than in anything in the cultures around about. I'm simply talking in terms of numbers of references here. Why did early Christianity so heavily focus on family language? Why did they talk about brothers? Why did they talk about adoption? Why did they talk about inheritance in the ways they did? Was it because this sort of language was widespread in Second Temple Judaism? Brother, yes. Adoption and inheritance, not really. Was the terminology also widespread in Greco-Roman associations? Did members of clubs and societies call each other, to use the New Zealand idiom, bro? The answer is occasionally, or at least the evidence we have is only occasional. There are brothers, there are also fathers and mothers of organisations, but those are nearly all 2nd century AD or later. Sisters are pretty rare. But in Rome there had been for centuries a priesthood known as the Arval Brotherhood. There's more to be said about this as well. But first let's talk about the range of family language. Properly first comes father, which could be God as a father, or could be other kinds of fathers. A Roman could, for example, be pater familias, father of the family. And one of them, but probably only one of them, could be pater patriae, father of his country. There were rough equivalents in Greek for fathers as dominant figures. There's the oikodespotes, the lord of the household, or the kurios, similarly the lord of the household. There's brother and sisters language, of course. The term familia in Latin is important. and it normally includes parents and children, along with other relatives. Agnates, for those of you who don't know, those are kindred exclusively through the male line, and cognates, which are more inclusive, through either the female or the male line. But there's also, as members of the familia, domestic slaves and other dependents, freedmen and clients. From a strictly legal perspective, the word familia could also mean the property of an estate that was inherited by the heirs or other agnate kin. But when applied to persons rather than property, it could designate all the kin or just the domestic slaves. That's the formulation of J.L. White. There were extended uses of the metaphor of a family. For example, the familia Caesaris, the family of Caesar, included his administrative staff, including many who were not in Rome. There was a branch of the familia Caesaris in several provincial cities. Then there's adoption, not just fathers, mothers, brothers and sisters, but adopted people. But it's crucial for us to remember that in the first century world, adoption was overwhelmingly the adoption of adults and almost completely the adoption of adult males for the benefit of the adoptive family, not for the benefit of the child. People did take on abandoned or disinherited or otherwise unsupported children, but this was not described as adoption. Adoption had to do with the right of inheritance. Inheritance was the primary purpose of adoption, to make sure that there was a male line to carry the family property, the family cults, and other family business into the future. That's what adoption was about. The literature studying early Christianity and Greco-Roman societies, and New Guinea society as well, regularly talks about fictive kinship. But I think there's a myth here, which is that there is an objective reality to kinship and other things are fictive. Kinship is actually a socially constructed concept. Biological kinship is not the same necessarily at all as social or cultural or historical forms of kinship. So it's not always obvious what's fictive, metaphorical, and what's not. In the ancient world, there is considerable evidence for the metaphorical use of the term brother. Plutarch has an entire essay on brotherly love. And he says in section 479d, "What sort of man is it who addresses his comrade as brother in salutations and in letters, but does not care even to walk with his own brother when they're going the same way?" In other words, Plutarch is aware that people do call companions bro, and he doesn't approve, or at least he doesn't approve if they don't treat their real brothers, biological brothers, well. He has a detailed discussion of how more and less successful, more and less prestigious, more or less fortunate brothers should relate to one another. And it's fascinating to set this in the context, or to set it up as part of the context, to Paul's discussion of stronger and weaker brothers, because the kinds of suggestions that Plutarch makes are actually reasonably similar to the ones Paul makes about how weaker and stronger brothers should treat one another. Peppard, in his article in the bibliography, points out that, and I quote, "When a wrong has been done to a father, brothers should do whatever possible to restore one another to a state of charis, grace, with their father. Brothers ought to rejoice and pride themselves in having surpassed their brothers in fairness and in grace." Charis again. brothers ought to relate to each other using the principle of charis, grace. Scott Barchi, in his article Undermining Ancient Patriarchy, argues that in ancient culture, he means Greco-Roman first century culture and more broadly, the sibling relationship was considered the most important relationship in which a person found themselves. He points out that in our culture, this is not taken for granted. We tend to presume that the most important relationship is the marriage relationship. But it's quite clear that in the ancient world, this was not seen to be the case. What really mattered was your blood brothers. Barchi is not the only person to argue this. Hellerman and Asgard agree. But Barchi deduces that, quote, Paul consistently employed forms of adelphos, brother, in every one of his undisputed letters as an essential image in his strategy for convincing his readers and hearers to treat each other as biological siblings had been socialized to do. The desired effect of these exhortations would have undermined traditional patriarchal relations, for even actual patriarchs were now regarded simply as brothers, even of their biological sons, even of their slaves. So something is going on when the early Christians lean heavily on brother language that we need to understand. Another possible context, other than actual family relationships, is the diplomatic context. Herodotus, Thucydides, other authors such as Polybius, and inscriptional evidence provide a fascinating case study because city-states in the Greco-Roman world often negotiated treaties with each other on the basis of syngonia, being of the same genos, being of the same, we would probably say, clan. The term is used in the New Testament, but only with its literal sense. It's never used metaphorically of the Christian genos. In the Greco-Roman world, kinship was often claimed via shared descent from gods and heroes in mythological time. It was on that basis that you claimed to be, we would say, family. I wonder here, I'm not aware that anyone has really developed this idea in scholarship, though somebody probably has, whether this is related to Paul's idea that all Christians are brothers in the sense that they are co-descendants from Abraham. It's their descent from Abraham, whether it be literally for Jewish Christians or metaphorically for Gentile Christians who are descended from Abraham by faith, that may be going on here. It is possible that Paul is drawing on the same linguistic background that came out in Greco-Roman diplomacy to say you are kin because of your common descent. Not only so, but it has to do with your status as being adopted children of God, adopted members of Abraham's family. And that has consequences for the inheritance that you can expect. And it also has consequences for how you should and should not treat one another. There are other metaphorical uses of kinship language, though I'm not really clear on how widespread they are. One Greco-Roman novel, Chares and Chaleroi, comments with a slave owner, male, speaking to his female slave, there is a kinship in character. And what he means is, we're actually similar people. You can talk to me. We would say in English, we are akin. One word, A-K-I-N. So there is clearly a good deal of metaphorical family language in Greco-Roman society. One important and difficult question is whether it is true that members of clubs and societies, voluntary associations, called each other brother. And if they did, how common it was and what consequences they might draw from it. As I mentioned earlier, there were not only brothers, there were also fathers and mothers of associations, though most of them were 2nd century AD or later, whereas sisters are actually almost unheard of. Presumably they weren't members of the societies to be there and to be called sister. Were there sororities? Peter Artsgrabner has shown that the term brother was used metaphorically in papyrus letters by officials writing to other officials, and not necessarily officials of equal rank, in both Greek and Latin letters. The terminology was used also by friends, by business associates, but, and this is controversial, he does not find any clear cases where the terminology is used by guild members, his term, or cult group members. Greco-Roman cults, it is claimed, called each other, members of them called each other brothers, but Peter Artsgrabner says the papyrological evidence won't support this, at least until the end of the 2nd century AD. It seems not to have been a regular part of Greco-Roman language. Brother is relatively commonly used to indicate closeness, trust, a common purpose, or similar, but not a common religious ideology, apparently. Harland, writing after, comments, "We know that fictive sibling language was used by some Jews in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, but so far we lack inscriptions that attest to this use of brothers among members of the synagogues." He does point out, though, that there is inscriptional evidence before 70 AD in some tomb inscriptions where a society of Greco-Roman people owned burial grounds and described them as follows: "If some brother wants to sell, let the other brothers, adelphois, purchase the land. But if the brother does so wish, let them then receive the money and depart from the association." You could be in an association that was designed to provide burial grounds, a club, if you like, a burial club, and describe other members as brother. But it doesn't seem to have been because of a religious affiliation. The term brother could be used of fellow functionaries as a term of belonging in the setting of a sanctuary. We find this in Egypt in the 2nd century BC, where a number of Greek Egyptians write to one another about being brothers in the context of living in the Serapeum in Memphis. But it doesn't become common until the 2nd or 3rd century AD. Not only that, but it's really not clear what is going on, because the letters and the inscriptions that we have don't seem to draw consequences, except in terms of membership, for the use of the brother and sister language. Plato does occasionally talk about men as brothers on the basis of close friendships. But as far as I can see, not in terms of religious affiliation. We should turn now to talk about the Pauline passages, but noting that there is a puzzle here that we cannot quickly resolve. We do not really know why early Christian writers chose this terminology so strongly when the evidence we have from the Greco-Roman world doesn't suggest a strong usage as background, and nor does the evidence of the Jewish world. Our problem is that the evidence we have of the Greco-Roman world and the Jewish world isn't of the same kind as the early Christian literature. Quite often, in the papyri and the inscriptions, it's not absolutely clear whether the term adelphos means literal blood brother, there I go using literal in a non-literal sense again, or whether it means fellow member, metaphorical brother. It's actually in some cases quite hard to tell. That's one of the reasons there are so few clear cases. It's also not clear what the consequences of brotherhood are, or whether it's simply a term of affection or at least of companionship. But when we look at the Pauline passages, several points become clear. Paul is advocating to his primarily Gentile converts the view that Abraham had natural children, Jewish people, but also now had adopted children, non-Jewish people, who gained a share in the inheritance of Abraham. This was controversial. There were plenty of other Jewish Christians who would have argued that Paul was far too easygoing in terms of the criteria determining adoption. But the Greco-Roman discussion of brotherly love and of inheritance highlights the fact that disputes about literal inheritance were common. Seneca actually tells us that one of the standard topics for orators to practice on was legal inheritance disputes between brothers. That was an absolutely standard topic. Pauline material suggests that he thought of this as happening among Christian brothers, both at a literal level, court cases, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and at a metaphorical level about adoption and inheritance as well. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 1 to 10, shows us that Paul had a very high ideal indeed of the ethical importance of brotherhood. The new RSV, though in many ways a very good translation, does tend to blur this fact because it doesn't always like to use the term brother. It's quite happy to use the terms brother and sister to argue that adelphos actually includes both. But there are other passages which are not clear. Quote 1 Thessalonians 4, possibly Paul's earliest letter. Finally, brothers, brackets and sisters, we ask and urge you in the Lord Jesus that as you learn from us how you ought to live and to please God, as in fact you are doing, you should do so more and more. You know what instructions we gave you through the Lord Jesus, for this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual sins, that each one of you know how to control your own body in holiness and honor, not with lustful passions like the Gentiles who do not know God. What an extraordinary thing to say to a group who were primarily Gentiles. What he literally calls them, of course, is the nations in Thessalonica. That no one should wrong or exploit a brother/sister in this matter, because the Lord is an avenger in all these things, just as we told you beforehand and solemnly warned you. God did not call us to impurity, but to holiness. Verse 9, now concerning love of the brothers and sisters, Philadelphia, an absolutely standard Greco-Roman term for the same thing. You do not need to have anyone write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another, and indeed you do love all the brothers and sisters throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, beloved, to do so more and more. For Paul, Philadelphia, metaphor for the new family, is a crucially important thing. The other candidate for Paul's earliest letter, it's difficult to decide, is Galatians, and chapter 4, verses 1 to 7, shows us him struggling with the metaphor of adoption. Again, he is dealing with Gentile Christians, overwhelmingly, some of whom would like to be more Jewish than they actually are. chapter 4, verse 1. My point, says Paul, is this. Heirs, as long as they are minors, are no better than slaves, though they are, potentially, owners of all the property. But they remain under guardians and trustees until the date set by the father. It is also so with us. While we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that you might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. You are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then also an heir. Now, all of that makes good sense under Greco-Roman legal frameworks, because a will could specify the age at which a son could inherit if his father died, but he couldn't inherit before that age, even if his father died. All of that made perfectly good sense. But there are two problems with the passage that I think Paul really doesn't clarify. It doesn't clarify the relative status of natural, quote, versus, quote, adopted children and heirs. Implicitly, Paul is clearly saying they have the same status. And it's entirely unclear to me what he's going to do with the metaphor if a will becomes operational when the father dies, because God doesn't. So is he saying there's a preliminary stage when you are effectively still a slave, but in fact a child inheritor, and there's a later stage in which you come into your inheritance, but without the father having actually died? I don't know what's going on there, and as far as I'm aware, no commentator has really taken that on. In other words, Paul's use of the metaphor has limits. In 1 Corinthians 6, verses 1 to 11, the family metaphor is dominant in the question of, are you allowed to take your brothers /and/or sisters to court? You would only be a brother taking your sisters to court, of course. Sisters couldn't take their brothers to court. When any of you has a grievance against another, do you dare to take it to court before the unrighteous instead of taking it before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels, to say nothing of ordinary matters? If you have ordinary cases, then, do you appoint as judges those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it truly be that there is no one among you wise enough to decide between one brother and another? But brother goes to court against brother, and before unbelievers. Notice, the pistoi, the faithful, go before the apistoi, unbelievers, in court cases. Clearly, Paul is saying that's outrageous. He goes on, in fact, to have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? But you yourselves wrong and defraud, and brothers at that. Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? He goes on. In other words, he would agree entirely with Plutarch that one of the really abominable things that brothers, quote unquote, sometimes do is take each other to court, whether it's about inheritance or anything else. Finally, we need to look briefly at Romans 8:29 for one refinement on the metaphor. This comes in the middle of one of Paul's most famous passages. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he, Jesus, might be the firstborn The NRSV says within a large family, but the Greek literally says among many brothers. You are all brothers in part because you are all brothers of Jesus, is what he's saying. And Jesus is the elder brother. Now we have here a range of ways in which family language was used in highly provocative ways in the Pauline literature. It's not only found in the Pauline literature, it's found throughout the New Testament. But Paul is the person who uses it most extensively, and as we've seen, in sometimes quite puzzling ways. But the important point to know is that it is not entirely clear why the early Christians seized on this brother and sister language and some of its consequences. It's not quite clear whether it was as remarkable as the statistics would make it seem. But what is clear is that it's not simply a matter of, oh, everyone was using it. More and more it was used in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. There'd be a great temptation to therefore say, perhaps the Greco-Roman world picked up on the fact that the early Christians were using it and thought, we'll go further with it. This seems unlikely. It seems unlikely because people ridiculed the early Christians for their use of brother and sister language, almost in the words of the Monty Python sketch. Brother and sister, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, know what I mean. But not only that, the evidence isn't strong enough to allow us to make that kind of claim. The papyri and the inscriptions show that the language was used in the wider context. Probably not as much, but it was there for use. And the early Christians followed up, I would suggest, on Jesus' critique of the literal family in favour of the family of faith, and developed brother and sister language, adoption language, and inheritance language as logical consequences of that concept. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brother Chris.
I should have seen that coming.
Has anyone got any questions or comments? Rosemary.
Good morning. Thank you so much. It's Rosemary Canavan here. I just wanted to say a word for the missing sisters among the brothers. The sense also, when you're speaking about Paul, we find at the beginning of Philemon, our sister Apphia, and that he uses these titles. And so that inclusiveness of the women among the brothers, so the brothers and sisters, is clearly in Paul in many ways, in the sense as maybe my Greek teacher wasn't right, but that if you had one male in a group, then the group is male, has a male, would be Adelphoi. So it would be hard to see where the women were in a general thing. So how did you approach that?
I agree. And there's also Phoebe the diakonos,
Yes,
who is
absolutely.
also Adelphae.
Yes.
So when he's referring to a particular female person, he does use the term sister. And I think the generalization is true that in a mixed group, the address would have been brothers. And I have no problem with the NRSV translating it as brothers and sisters because of that. I don't think this is likely to be the same thing in the Greco-Roman evidence.
And just a sense of something that I had thought about previously and written about, the use in beginning of 1 Thessalonians, where we have a repetition of all sorts of familial language, that I have proposed that that is him forming the ecclesia in a familial space. We have God the Father, the Son, we have Paul as father, or brothers and sisters. We have the whole range. I call it portrait of the family of Christ in ecclesia. So a sense. I don't know what you think about that.
I think Paul is saying that the church is a kind of, we would say, fictive family. And the people who've written about this the most are Scott Barchi, Joseph Hellerman, who I think is one of Barchi's students, and there's somebody else, but I've forgotten which one they are now. Oh no, Radar Asgard has written on this in extensive detail. But yes, that 1 Thessalonians passage, you're right, has quite a spread of family terminology, simply to emphasize the ethical consequences of being brothers and sisters.
Good morning, Chris. I was hoping you wouldn't be flat. I see you are still C sharp. Very good. I have a few points, please, and for you in response and for you to respond. Could you comment a little about the views of James, the brother of the Lord, and the spectrum of different implications that has for your views, and secondly, the kinship of the bloodline of Semites in today's situation. The Palestinians, I think, are more Semitic than the Jews, because Palestinians probably arose from the Semites, whereas the proselyted Jews of Eastern Europe are not as Jewish as the Palestinians in that sense, or as Semitic. Could you comment on that, since it's relevant? And finally, you said it's so strange that we see brotherly language in Christianity. Could it be that there was some Gnostic connection there, where kinship was very strong in that way of thinking, that the Pauline thought brought that in? Thank you, Chris.
Number one, James, the brother of the Lord. I see no reason to think anything but that it means literally the brother, or we might say the half-brother, but adelphos can mean that. I see nothing to suggest that it simply means brother in the sense that we are all brothers. It specifies James, the brother of the Lord, you know, that one. And I think the same applies to Jude. He is also thought to be a brother of Jesus. Number two, I'm very carefully not going to say anything about the modern situation in Israel as an historian, because I think there's simply far too great a historical difference between the situations we're talking about in this material and the situations we're talking about now. I do not know how to find out whether the Palestinians are more Semitic than the Israeli population. I simply don't know how one would know that. You can't do it because you've got no DNA to test it against. What's Semitic DNA? No, I didn't. But I will say this, and I'll quote the great Canadian ancient historian of Alexander, who in a conference in Melbourne said, you have to understand that ethnicity is made up of 50% a common mistake about your ancestors and 50% a common dislike of your neighbours. This caused such outrage in the conference, Greek archaeologists actually walked out because Greek ethnicity mattered so profoundly to them. Ethnicity matters profoundly, but it is largely a cultural construct that changes from time to time and from place to place. I'm not therefore going to say anything about that as an historian. If you want to ask me about it as an individual in the modern world. I'll comment on it later, but not from the podium. The third one was, is there a link with Gnosticism? The short answer is I don't know. But since Gnosticism is overwhelmingly a 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD phenomenon, I think it's far more likely that it drew on the early Christian context than that it provided context for the early Christians. I think that's the best short answer I can give.
Thank you. I'm Gillian Asquith. Thanks, Chris, so much. You mentioned Jesus just in your very last sentence. And I'm reminded of the story in the Gospels where people say to Jesus, your mother and your brothers are outside. And at that point, he redefines who his mother and his brothers are. And he actually uses the word sister as well.
Yes.
Anyone who does the will of the Father is my mother, brother, and sister. So assuming Paul had access to that Jesus saying, do you think we could simply explain the prevalence of the family metaphor in Paul's writings simply by the precedent set by Jesus?
The short answer to that is I think so, but I think it's very hard to prove. I think it is more likely if we generalize a little and say that Paul almost certainly had access to that kind of material from Jesus. And the reason I think that is not just that Paul uses it so much, but that everyone else uses it as well. I think they're all drawing on the same basic origin. The fact that Jesus used fictive family language for his own movement. Fictive family is our cultural category, of course. He talked about the family of God as being more important than the family we would say of blood. I think that is quite clear. And the early Christian movement as a whole, including Paul, picks up on that.
Well, we better conclude there. Well, thank you, Chris, for that another enlightening paper and gives us much to think about and probably not reach any conclusions. Yeah, we're such as life. Okay. Thanks, you, Chris.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a confusing move, we now switch roles, Don and I.
That's right.
Because I introduce him. However, I was going to say something else.